Hello everyone. Thank you first of all for your first submissions. I will try to grade those as soon as I can. Like everything else, it just seems to take time, much more than it would ordinarily if we were meeting in person, but I will do my best to respond in a timely fashion. So what we're going to do now is work towards a second submission, and the preparation for that will involve three texts. So the first one I have attached to the accompanying email as a PDF file, and that's by Canadian musicologist. He is called Jean-Jacques Nattiez, and the title of his article is Can One Speak of Narrativity in Music? And published in 1990. So, as before, I'll ask a set of questions about each of the three articles, but I'm thinking this is how we will move forward. This article questions the validity of musical narratology. I'll then move to a second article published in the mid 2000s, about 2005, by Fred Everett Morse, and that appraises the position in a favourable light of what we can expect from musical narratology after essentially a first wave of inquiry amongst musicologists and other musicians about the value of narrative interpretation. And then what we'll do is have a case study looking at a particular piece or set of pieces from the bibliography that was part of the original syllabus outline. So three texts, and we'll see how we progress with those, but that's what I'm thinking. So case for the, shall we say, the accused, and case for the defense, and then case study. That's the way we're going to, sorry, case for the prosecution is what I meant to say. So this would be the case for the prosecution from Nattiez, then the case for the defense from Fred Everett Morse, and then a case study which seems to make good use of narrative interpretation. Okay, so those are going to be the three sources we'll be looking at, so I'll let you know what they are as we move along. But the first one then by Nattiez, and he taught for a long time, retired now, I think, from the University of Montreal in Canada. So let's begin at the very start on page 240. Nattiez says, first of all, that he notes that there was indeed a sort of disciplinary expansion of interest in musical narratology beginning in the late 1980s, with particular studies emanating from scholars such as Anthony Newcomb, Marta Graboch, and Caroline Abate. He observes the importance that we place on the idea that the composer speaks to us through their music. He says this is just a commonly accepted precept. And he said, actually, if we wanted to then look for higher level intellectual support for that, we could certainly find it from the Belgian structural anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who we've encountered a few times, who says, yes, indeed, of course, music is closely associated throughout human history with myth. So, Nattiez had previously considered, he tells us, the association between music and narrative to be simply a metaphor, not actually, in other words, substantive. But now he acknowledges that it is more widely resonant, and for the reason that he should know very well, because he counts himself as a musical semiologist, somebody who looks at the way that music functions as a sign system, the same way that language or sort of pictorial communication function as independent or sometimes interrelated sign systems. He notes that yes, indeed, narrative is about causal connection, temporal causal connection. Well, we've seen this in the things that we have read, but he introduces another source that deals with story and discourse. He says, yes, there, causal correspondence is important to an author called Seymour Chapman, who produced a study in 1978, a monograph. Now, Nattiez says, all right, here are two initial propositions. This is what I believe, and this is what I will try to evaluate in the course of my article. Number one, that hearing music in a narrative sense requires a prior cue. For us to hear music as narrative will require a prior cue. So what is that prior cue? Is it of different kinds? And he says, yeah, that cue could be a genre, say symphonic poem, or it could be the title of a piece, say Sorcerer's Apprentice. But to make use of that cue even, we still have to refer to a literary precedent. In other words, music does not bring its narrative credentials to bear, but that we read it through the lens of verbal communication. Now, Nattiez follows Paul Ricoeur, who of course we have read about, and Caroline Abate, who's these days at Harvard, in accepting that time and space are given narrative form through an act of interpretation. They are not there objectively. We give them a sense of narrative form through the act of interpretation, and it is an act, he says. Music's evocative possibilities, music always leads us to think of other things beyond itself, suggests that it refers to experience outside the realm of pure form. So he contradicts 19th century scholars like Edward Hanslick said, no, music certainly does not just exist as a play of form. Here then is question 1. And I'm going to ask a set of 10 questions overall. I'll split the videos into 2. So the first video will have 5 questions and the second video will have 5. So here is question 1. And I'm round about page 243 now. Which 3 types of extrinsic referral does Nattiez acknowledge? Which 3 types of extrinsic referral, so reference outside of purely musical form, does Nattiez acknowledge? Nattiez recognises, moving on, that music and verbal discourse are indeed both conditioned temporally. They are dependent on time. And now here is question 2. Even though he said this, does Nattiez, following Caroline Abate, believe that music has a past tense? Does music have a past tense? Question 2. So moving on again, Nattiez argues that music lacks a subject-predicate relationship. You cannot understand a music subject and say things about it, like the sky, subject is blue, predicate, and that it cannot specify details of location. So it cannot tell us, even if it is something like Till Eulenspiegel, where the events are taking place in any clear and transparent way. Question 3. Which quote from Adorno does Nattiez advance in order to sum up his reservations? Which brief quote from Adorno does Nattiez advance in order to sum up his reservations? Nattiez proposes that these problems that we've just been thinking through arise because the idea that music suggests narrative simply becomes confused with the idea that it is therefore narrative. In other words, the idea that music suggests narrative becomes confused with the idea that it is narrative. He calls this an ontological slippage. In other words, we move from something which is metaphorical to something which is actually there, a real thing, what the philosophers call ontology, the structure of reality. So 2 more questions and then I will end this first video. Question 4. In referring to a French historian, Paul Vane, and subsequently American historian Hayden White on the topic of plot, which again we've covered, Nattiez asserts that events read through plot do not narrate, but rather do what? So a word that is close to narrate, but he said they do not narrate, but they do something else. What is that word? So, final question of this first video, question 5. In this respect, Nattiez asserts 2 further conditions by which plot construction is enabled. 2 further conditions by which plot construction is enabled. What are these? Okay, so that's the end of the first part of this article. 5 questions. And then I'll supply another 5, so 10 questions in all. So I'm just going to stop this first taping and then we'll move to a second video to follow on directly. All right? So, bye for now.